Hi, welcome to my channel and thanks for tuning in today for some life advice and relationship tips. So there might be a little bit of activity in the background and try to ignore that if it happens. But I wanted to go back today to a topic that I used to talk a lot about when I was in practice in particular. Now I am a retired mental health and marriage and family therapist and I work as a life and relationship coach online. But one of the topics that was always really important was, especially with couples, but generally with everybody, intimacy. It is sorely misunderstood. A lot of people just think sex when you hear intimacy. Did you? Probably, that's normal. But I wanted to expand on it today in a video because I get asked about this all the time on Twitter in particular, and I always feel like I've already talked about it, but there's never enough conversation about this topic and instruction to really expand on it, clarify it, and help you know how it works. So I talk about the 8 intimacies, or needs, as I like to say. The interesting thing is that some people assume this is only to be fulfilled by your significant other, but that's not the case necessarily. And you'll see, I'll go through the 8 intimacies one by one, and I will talk about who would be the appropriate person to get that need met from. So number 1. Now, these are not in order. So I want to clarify that first. These are in random order, and then we're going to do a little exercise at the end. So the first one I'll talk about is emotional intimacy. Emotional intimacy is when you talk about your feelings with someone. So this can be done with other people other than your spouse or your significant other, but it is really essential. You have to be able to talk about your feelings with that person, but also your friends and your family. And to varying degrees, obviously, depending on the trust and attachment level in that relationship. So that one is open for multiple relationships to meet that need, but it does have to be met by your significant other as well. The next one is intellectual intimacy, which is an interesting one. You do need to have your intellectual intimacy need met by your significant other. This is the concept of talking about and sharing your ideas. So it's important to have that level of chemistry and compatibility with your significant other, but you can also have a level of intellectual intimacy with people like that you work with, or you can get that need met through hobbies as well, or learning information, reading books, sharing ideas in different types of like book clubs or online even. Now, the only danger really comes into play when, like, if you've heard about the sort of, I don't know where it came from, but the term of like having a work husband or a work wife. Now, this is tricky when it's someone of the opposite sex, and you kind of have this segmentation of intimacy between your partner at home, not having intellectual intimacy with them, and then finding it with someone of the opposite sex in like a more intellectual setting. So this creates divisiveness, and basically it's like having, in this case, it wouldn't be an emotional affair, it would be an intellectual affair with someone. So you do have to be mindful of that and avoid it. This is not good. So 1, you want to vet for a partner who is on par with you intellectually, but 2, if you're going to have some variation in that proclivity, then you're going to seek someone of the same sex who's going to be able to give you that connection there. Or if it's just, it's non-gender issue, you're just gaining knowledge in a community setting or online and something like that in a book club. But then again, be careful when you connect with people of the opposite sex in that level of close-knit community. Okay, so the third one we can talk about is affectional. So affectional intimacy is when you're doing thoughtful things for each other, right? Like you're sharing objects of affection or words of affection to show that closeness that you have with someone. So whether it be through just non-sexual touch, or whether it's through love notes or thoughtful gestures, the ways that you express your affection with someone is going to be highly important for both parties, whether the man or the woman, maybe to a little bit of a varying degree, but depending on your love language too. It is something that is going to be met by your significant other particularly, but you also get, thoughtful things, gifts, hugs and kisses from your family and friends as well. So just be mindful of the opposite gender problem and you should be okay. So that's 3. Number 4 let's go to spiritual intimacy. Spiritual intimacy is whether you're a particularly religious person or you have more non-denominational spiritual religious beliefs, then those sharing that practice and those belief systems, it's going to be important for you to have with your significant other in particular, but also, you might have a community that you share that with, and you have family traditions that you also share with them as well. So it goes beyond the significant other relationship, but that's going to be the most prominent one that you're going to be looking for alignment on spiritual beliefs there. And maybe it's not something that is particularly important to you, and so you want that to be shared as well. The next one I will talk about is aesthetic intimacy. Aesthetic intimacy is kind of similar to the spiritual intimacy if you're non-denominational, but generally speaking, aesthetic intimacy is sharing things that bring joy and beauty. So it could be a landscape, a beautiful setting, it could be art, literature, architecture, sunrise, sunset, beachscapes, like anything like that, but beauty, around beauty and aesthetics. So people might have more need for that than others, but generally speaking, if it is something that is important to you, then you're going to want to share those lovely moments with your significant other for the most part. Again, there's some room for friends and family to be there as well when as appropriate, but I think ultimately, those moments really call for someone close at heart. So keep that in mind, and be careful who you're sharing those really beautiful moments with if you don't want them to be of the opposite sex. So that's kind of a theme, so definitely underscore that and take notes there. I did do a video on opposite sex friends, so you can look that one up too, because that goes into more detail. All right, the next one would be physical intimacy. So physical intimacy is not sexual intimacy. It's in regards to companionship. So the physical presence and company that you keep on a regular basis. So this is just doing stuff like living life together, not just running errands and getting the groceries and driving here and there and taking care of the kids, household chores or anything like that, but actual just sitting with someone. So you absolutely have to have this with your significant other. But again, you are going to have this as well with friends. It's going to be important to be able to, and family probably mostly, sit around and enjoy their company doing absolutely nothing from time to time. So, and maybe going on errands too, right? Like you go to the doctors, you go to the grocery store. These things are important to do and make the best of them. So you want to be with people that you enjoy being around. And then sexual intimacy. So sexual intimacy is probably the most cut and dry one, but any kind of sexual contact or activity is going to be had with your significant other. But that is not necessarily the non-sexual physical expressions of affection that we talked about in affectional intimacy, and it's not the physical intimacy that I just talked about, which is just more like being in their physical presence and enjoying their company, non-sexually. So I think that covers it. I said emotional, intellectual, physical, sexual, spiritual, aesthetic, affectional, and social. So the last one is social intimacy. Social intimacy is the trickiest one. So let me try to slow this one down. We have a need to be somewhat social. There isn't a real requirement to be very social, but you may either want to be social one-on-one with your partner, or with small groups, with other couple friends, or some people really want to have their own social time outside of the relationship. So this is where it can get tricky. You have to know where your partner lies in their boundaries. How do they feel about that? Where's the trust level? So let's talk about that, or it's important for you to talk about that with your partner and see how they feel and what is it about? Like, is it just that it's not their preference, or is it that they feel anxiety? Is there a lack of trust? It could be a few different things. But if you share the same temperament and the same preferences, then it makes life easier. So if you both like to be social, but you prefer to be social as a couple, great. That would be the easiest cut and dry, best case scenario. And so you don't really spend a whole bunch of time one-on-one, but obviously you can leave each other's company and feel totally safe to do so and trust each other, and everything goes fine. And so that's a good time to spend time with your same-sex friends. Again, There may be some exceptions when you have like a group setting where there's opposite sex friends, but you need to be very careful, right, with that opposite sex friendship. Having any kind of one-to-one time is very tricky. So limit it as much as possible. And if it is someone who you've known for a very long time under like, grand life circumstances, then obviously there may be some exceptions there. But as a rule, just try not to cultivate any new opposite sex friendships. And when you do couple up, then it's great. You can always coordinate and communicate with the same sex partner of your friend. So those are the 8 intimacies. Now, here are the exercises that I want you to do. A, I'll jot them down in the notes below, but if you glance at them and you take your own notes, I would rank order them. So rank order them from number 1 being the most important to number 8 being the least important. And this can change at any point in time. So you will notice that it fluctuates depending on what your interests are and if your values shift a little bit. But generally speaking, you might see a trend of like the top 3 kind of always stay around the top and the bottom 3 kind of always stay around the bottom, but they do shift a bit. So what's important is where they're at now and to revisit this from time to time. But it is really hard for some people to distinguish a rank order, right? Like it's hard to distinguish between number 1 and number 2, but just force yourself to do it as an exercise and go with your gut. Don't overthink it. So if you feel like, and the other thing is people ask me, am I thinking about this from the frame of reference of my relationship, or am I thinking about this just generally? What I would say is start, because not all of you are coupled, some of you are single, but I would think about it generally, just as like your needs being met. Right now, what is your most important need? Is it affectional? Is it emotional? Is it intellectual? Maybe it's spiritual. Maybe it's social. So just be honest and go through and rank order them. Now, some of them may not be important to you, or some of them may be fulfilled, and so they kind of aren't really on your radar because it's easy to get those needs met. Maybe social is really easy for you to get met, or maybe it's because you feel like you are socializing enough and there's not a lack there. So for whatever reason, if that's on the bottom of your list or you kind of cross it out, that's okay. We don't have to focus on that now. What we really want to focus on are the top 3. So if we see the top 3 as emotional, intellectual, and affectional, and then you want to get those met by your partner and they're not getting met, then we really need to work on how to get those met as a couple, if you're coupled. Now, if you're not coupled, then you're obviously going to be getting those met from your friends and your family. But this is where it gets a little bit tricky. If your partner has their 8 intimacies ranked very differently, it's not necessarily a bad thing. You just have to negotiate and you have to kind of collaborate and cooperate together to get all your needs met that are required by your partner. I mean, you should know this going in. That's what vetting is for. But let's say there's some tweaking that needs to be done after the fact. So your partner is sexual, intellectual, and affectional. So great, you both got affectional on the list. You can kind of check in and see how you're doing, and then, give credit where credit is due, and then say, I'd like a little bit more of this, I'd like a little bit more of that, or not so much this, and just communicate openly. Now, if they've got, let's say sexual, this is quite frequent, where maybe the man has sexual and the woman doesn't even have it on the top. So then you have to reconcile that and say, okay, well, it's kind of like an extension of the love languages. It goes a little bit further into that clarification of what you're looking for in order to be satisfied in your relationship. So if you feel like sex is not the number 1 thing, number 2 or number 3 thing, you still have to tend to it because it's your partner's thing. So you can't neglect that need because it has to come from you, and you're not really fulfilling that. It's not an obligation, but you're not fulfilling that duty in a way. If you're going to be in a sexual relationship with someone that you love and they need to have that closeness and sexual intimacy, you have to reframe it for yourself, right? A lot of times it's from something else that you lack the desire, or you lack the initiative, or you lack the energy, or whatever it is, like maybe it's the trust or the communication or the sexual desire sometimes is really just related to aesthetics. So address those issues, but ultimately, if you love the person, you respect them, then you're going to be able to make those efforts without it feeling like it's an obligation or some kind of burden. It would take a lot more in-depth conversations with me in order to sort through that, but just on the surface, that's what I would say. Now, let's just say it's not about any kind of incompatibility and desire, but just that it's not one of the top 3 most important things for the woman. And so being fully desiring of your partner and respecting of them, you're totally willing to make them happy, and you're pleased by making them pleased. So then what I would point out to you is that if his isn't emotional, and that's your number in your top 3, and his is sexual, then just know that, well, he's trying to fulfill your need to have emotional intimacy, and you're fulfilling his sexual intimacy. So it's a win-win. Nobody's losing here. There is no compromise. I don't like that word because I think it sounds like somebody's losing, but it's not. It's best case scenario. People get enough of what they need and what they want in order to be happy. So that's the goal in meeting your 8 intimacy needs and evaluating them together as a couple, or even as an individual, right? It's really important as an individual who's single to know what your needs are and how you're getting them met and making sure they're healthy. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Ciao. Don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and comment at the bottom.